Some people are told from birth that they're too much, too loud, too ambitious, too defiant. The world gives them a script and expects them to follow it. Stay small. Stay quiet. Know your place. But every once in a while, someone tears up that script. They walk through doors that were never supposed to open. They change laws. They save lives. They reshape entire cities. And sometimes, the world doesn't forgive them for it. This is the story of a woman who refused to be small. A woman who became the first. Who kicked down doors. Who made history. And then one night in August of 1965, someone decided she had gone too far. Her name was Alberta Jones. She was 34 years old. She was Louisville's first black female prosecutor. And 60 years after her murder, no one has ever answered for taking her life. This is unfinished record. If you believe stories like Alberta's deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button right now. And if you want to see justice for cases that have been buried for too long, turn on those notifications. Because we're just getting started. Before we talk about how Alberta Jones died, you need to understand who she was when she was alive. Because this isn't just another cold case. This isn't just another unsolved murder. This is the story of someone who should be in every history book in America. Someone whose name should be as well known as Rosa Parks or Harriet Tubman. Someone who mattered. Alberta O'Neill Jones was born in 1930 in Louisville, Kentucky. She came into a world that had already decided what her life would look like. She was black. She was female. And in the American South in 1930, that meant the door was already closed before she even learned to walk. The country had a script for black girls. Stay quiet. Don't reach too high. Accept less. Expect less. That was the deal. But nobody ever asked Alberta if she agreed to that deal. And she didn't. From the very beginning, she refused. We don't know a lot about Alberta's childhood. Most records focus on what she accomplished later, when she was already making history. But we know this. She was brilliant. Not just smart. Brilliant. She went to Louisville Central High School. Back then, they didn't even pretend it was equal. They called it Louisville Colored High School. Separate. Inferior. Designed to prepare black children for lives that would never demand much of them. But Alberta graduated with honors. In a system designed to limit her, she excelled anyway. Think about what that means. She was surrounded by people telling her she wasn't good enough. The textbooks were older. The buildings were worse. The expectations were lower. And she still graduated at the top. That's not luck. That's defiance. After high school, Alberta enrolled at Louisville Municipal College for Negroes. It was one of the only places in Kentucky where black students could go to college. And then in 1951, something shifted. The college merged with the University of Louisville as part of desegregation efforts. And Alberta Jones walked through a door that had been locked her entire life. She became one of the first black students to attend the University of Louisville. Stop and imagine that for a second. Walking into a classroom where nobody who looks like you has ever sat. Where the white students around you were raised believing you were inferior. Where the professors aren't sure you belong. Where every single day, just showing up is an act of courage. Alberta didn't just show up. She dominated. In 1959, she graduated third in her entire class. Third, out of everyone. Not third among black students. Third out of every single student in that university. Let that register. She didn't just make history by being there. She outperformed almost everyone who was supposed to have every advantage she didn't have. She crushed it. To really understand Alberta, you need to understand the world she was living in. This was the late 1950s. Early 1960s. The civil rights movement wasn't something you read about in a textbook. It was happening in real time. In the streets. Black families were being beaten for trying to vote. Children were being attacked for going to school. Leaders were being killed for speaking up. This wasn't ancient history. This was Alberta's everyday reality. And she didn't just want to survive it. She wanted to change it. So after she finished her undergraduate degree, she enrolled in law school at the University of Louisville. She spent 1 year there. And then she made a decision that tells you everything about who she was at her core. She transferred to Howard University in Washington, D.C. Now, if you don't know about Howard, let me explain. Howard University wasn't just another law school. It was the law school for civil rights lawyers. Thurgood Marshall studied there. Charles Hamilton Houston taught there. It was where black lawyers learned how to use the law as a weapon against injustice. Where legal strategy and activism met. Where students learned that law wasn't just about courtrooms. It was about changing the world. For Alberta Jones, Going to Howard wasn't about prestige. It was about purpose. She wanted the tools to fight back. And once again, she excelled. She graduated fourth in her class at Howard. Fourth out of everyone. When she came back home to Louisville in 1959, she took the Kentucky bar exam. And she became the first black woman in the entire state of Kentucky to pass it. The first. Ever. Think about the weight of that for a second. Every black girl in Kentucky who ever dreamed of being a lawyer, Alberta made that dream possible. She didn't just achieve something for herself. She kicked down a door for everyone who would come after her. And when a local newspaper asked her about this historic achievement, she said something that shows you exactly who she was. She said, and I quote, "If I had known how much was depending on me, I would have studied harder and I would have worn something different." Even while making history, she was humble, self-deprecating, more worried about her outfit than her place in history. That was Alberta, never making it about herself, always focused on the work. After passing the bar, Alberta did something that was almost unheard of for a black woman in 1959. She opened her own law practice in downtown Louisville, not in the black part of town. Downtown. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't playing it safe. She was taking up space in a part of the city where people like her weren't supposed to be. And she thrived. One of her earliest clients was a young boxer from Louisville. Just a kid, really. Local guy trying to make it. His name was Cassius Clay. You might know him better as Muhammad Ali. In 1960, Alberta negotiated his first professional boxing contract. Nobody knew then that he would become one of the most famous human beings in history. But Alberta saw something in him. She protected him. She made sure he got a fair deal. But boxing contracts were just the beginning for Alberta. That wasn't why she went to law school. She didn't go to Howard to get rich. She went there to change things. She joined the NAACP. She started using her legal knowledge to help black people register to vote. And if you think that sounds simple, if you think that sounds safe, understand this. In 1960 America, helping black people vote could get you killed. People were beaten in the streets. Homes were firebombed. Civil rights workers were murdered. But Alberta kept going. She didn't just talk about change. She organized it. She built it. She founded an organization called the Independent Voters Association. And that organization registered more than 6,000 black voters in Louisville. 6,000 people who had been denied their constitutional right their entire lives. 6,000 voices that had been silenced. Alberta gave them back their power. And in 1961, those 6,000 people showed up at the polls. They voted out a mayor and an alderman who had refused to support anti-discrimination laws. And because of that election, Louisville passed a public accommodations ordinance. The first one in the entire state of Kentucky. That meant black people could finally walk into restaurants, hotels, and stores and be served like human beings. For the first time. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't luck. That was Alberta Jones and 6,000 people she personally organized. One voice, one vote, one victory at a time. In 1963, Alberta traveled to Washington, D.C. She stood on the National Mall with hundreds of thousands of people at the March on Washington. She heard Martin Luther King Jr. deliver his "I Have a Dream" speech in real time. She wasn't observing history from the sidelines. She was standing in it, making it, demanding it. She once said something that I think captures her entire philosophy on life. She said, "A lot of people told me, you've got 2 strikes against you. You're a woman and you're a Negro. Yeah, but I've got 1 strike left. And I've seen people get home runs when all they've got is 1 strike." That wasn't just a clever quote. That was how she lived every single day of her life. By 1964, Alberta Jones wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a force. The city of Louisville appointed her as assistant city attorney. And then they appointed her prosecutor for the domestic relations court. She became the first woman in Louisville, of any race, to hold either position. The first woman. Period. Let that sink in. Alberta Jones, a black woman in the segregated South, was now standing in courtrooms prosecuting cases. And a lot of those cases involved white men as defendants. Men who had grown up in a world where black people had to step off the sidewalk when they walked by. Men who had been taught their entire lives that black women were beneath them. But now they had to stand in front of Alberta Jones and answer for their actions. Now they had to face consequences. Now they had to look her in the eye and call her Your Honor. She had done it. She had broken through every single barrier. Education, law, politics. She was 34 years old, and she was just getting started. But the position she had just earned, Louisville's first black female prosecutor, would be the last job Alberta Jones would ever hold. Because 6 months later, her body would be pulled from the Ohio River. And 60 years later, no one has ever paid for her murder. And listen, I need to hear from you right now. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. Are you in Louisville, Kentucky? Somewhere else in the United States? Somewhere across the world? I want to know who's hearing Alberta's story today, because her name deserves to be known everywhere. Go ahead and comment. I really want to know. By the summer of 1965, Alberta was living at home with her mother, Sadie, and her sister, Flora. She was 34 years old. She wasn't married. She didn't have children. And back then, that was unusual. Society expected women her age to be wives and mothers first, everything else second. But Alberta had built her entire life around her work. She was focused. She was driven. She was changing her city. And she didn't apologize for any of it. While other women were building families inside their homes, Alberta was dismantling unjust systems outside of hers. August 4th, 1965. It started like any other Thursday evening in Louisville. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. Just a normal summer night. Alberta was home with Flora. They were just sitting around, talking, relaxing. And then, late that night, the phone rang. And this is where everything gets complicated. Because what happened next, the story of Alberta's last hours on Earth, depends entirely on who you ask and when you ask them. According to the Louisville Courier-Journal newspaper, in August of 1965, Flora told police that the phone call came around 11:30 at night. A friend was asking Alberta to come over. But decades later, in 2018, when Flora was interviewed by a local TV station, she told a completely different story. She said the call came at 10 p.m. Now, you might be thinking, okay, 53 years had passed. Flora was in her 80s by then. Memory fades. Details blur. That's understandable. But we're not talking about a small difference here. We're talking about an hour and a half. And in a murder investigation, timeline is everything. An hour and a half can be the difference between life and death, between guilt and innocence, between truth and lies. And the time of the call isn't the only thing that changed over the years. When Flora spoke publicly decades later, the entire story of that night sounded different. Not slightly different. Completely different. The reason for the call, the tone of the conversation, the mood, everything. And when the story of someone's final hours keeps changing, that matters. That raises questions. Here's what was reported in the newspapers in August of 1965, just days after Alberta's death. According to police reports at the time, Alberta received a phone call around 11:30 p.m. The caller was identified as a close friend, a woman named Gladys Wyatt. Gladys ran a beauty salon out of her home. And according to what Gladys told police, she had called Alberta to come over and get fitted for a wig she had previously ordered. A wig fitting. At 11:30 at night. Now, that's unusual, right? Most businesses are closed by then. Most people are getting ready for bed. But Gladys operated her salon out of her house, so technically she could work whatever hours she wanted. Still, 11:30 at night for a wig fitting is not normal. But according to Gladys's statement to police, Alberta came over to her house. She tried on the wig. Then the two women decided to go out and get something to eat at a restaurant. After eating, they came back to Gladys's house. They sat and talked for a while. And then, around 1:30 in the morning, Alberta left to go home. And according to Gladys, when Alberta walked out that door, she was wearing the wig. That was the story in 1965. That's what went into the police reports. That's what the newspapers printed. A late-night wig fitting, a meal at a restaurant, some conversation, and then Alberta left wearing her new wig around 1:30 a.m. But when Flora spoke publicly in 2018, more than 50 years after her sister's death, she told a story that was almost completely different. In this version, the phone call didn't come at 11:30. It came at 10 p.m. And the reason for the call wasn't cosmetic. It wasn't about a wig at all. According to Flora's 2018 account, the friend who called was having legal trouble. She needed Alberta's help with something legal. Alberta was a prosecutor by this point. She had authority. She had connections. And this friend needed her. But Alberta told the caller it was too late to do anything that night. She said they could deal with it in the morning. And that's when, according to Flora, the tone of the conversation changed. The friend allegedly said to Alberta, and I quote, "Since you've got this position, you've gotten so uppity that you don't have time for any of your friends. Uppity. That word has a very specific history, especially when directed at Black people. It's a word used to put people in their place, to remind them not to get too comfortable with success, to suggest they've forgotten where they came from. And according to Flora, Alberta was sensitive about that accusation. She never wanted people to think her education, her success, her title made her better than anyone. She never wanted to seem like she'd changed. So even though she was tired, even though it was late, she agreed to go. "Okay, I'm coming," she said. Flora described the last time she saw her sister alive. Alberta was sitting on the couch in their living room, reading a magazine about President John F. Kennedy's assassination. That had happened just 2 years earlier, in 1963. The country was still processing it, still grieving, still trying to understand how something like that could happen. And then Alberta looked up from the magazine and said something that would haunt Flora for the rest of her life. "I hope I don't get assassinated." Flora tried to laugh it off. She said, "Don't worry about it. You're not the president of the United States." It was meant to be light, a joke between sisters, a way to break the tension. But within hours, Alberta would be dead. Two completely different versions of the same night. Two completely different reasons for the phone call. A wig fitting versus legal trouble. 11:30 versus 10 p.m. A casual outing versus a tense confrontation. And these contradictions matter, because one of these versions is closer to the truth than the other. Or maybe neither of them is completely accurate. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Or maybe someone had a reason to change their story. We don't know. But what we do know is this. By the morning of August 5, 1965, Alberta Jones wasn't Louisville's prosecutor anymore. She was a body floating in the Ohio River. On the morning of August 5th, a group of teenage boys were down by the Ohio River. It was summer. They were probably just hanging out, enjoying the weather. And then they saw something in the water, about 15 feet from the shore. Something floating. At first, they probably weren't sure what it was. But as they got closer, they realized. It was a body. They called the police immediately. Officers arrived at the scene and pulled the body from the river. It was a woman. She was fully clothed, but there was no identification on her. No wallet, no purse, no ID of any kind. For hours, nobody knew who she was. Meanwhile, across town, Alberta hadn't come home. Her mother, Sadie, was worried. Around 1:30 that afternoon, she made a phone call. But interestingly, she didn't call the regular police department. She called the Louisville Crime Prevention Bureau. Now, that's an interesting detail, isn't it? Why the Crime Prevention Bureau specifically? Was it intentional? Did Sadie call them because her daughter was a prosecutor and she knew that's who to contact? Or was that just the number she happened to have? We don't know. The records don't tell us. But later that day, the body from the river was identified. It was Alberta Jones. The person who made the identification was a young lawyer named Daryl Owens. He shared office space with Alberta downtown. He wasn't family. He was just a colleague. We don't really know why he was the one asked to identify her body. Alberta had a brother, but he may have been living out of state at the time. Maybe it was just too traumatic for Sadie and Flora to do it themselves. Maybe the police thought it would be easier for a colleague. We don't know the reason. But years later, Daryl Owens would say that identifying Alberta's body was the worst day of his entire life. When Alberta's body was pulled from the Ohio River, she was fully dressed. But there were things missing. Things that should have been there but weren't. Her shoes were gone. The wig that Gladys said she was wearing when she left her house. Gone. But here's the detail that stands out. The detail that's haunting. Alberta's dentures were missing. Both the upper and lower dentures. Now, you might be surprised to learn that a 34-year-old woman wore full dentures. But Alberta did. And they weren't on her body when she was found. Police also noted that she wasn't wearing any jewelry. Flora later told investigators that Alberta never wore jewelry. Not even a watch. But if you look at photographs of Alberta, you can see her wearing at least a necklace in some pictures. So maybe she just wasn't wearing any jewelry that particular night. Or maybe something else happened. And then there was her car. A white 1965 Ford Fairlane. A rental. It wasn't at the river. It was nowhere near where her body was found. On August 6th, the Louisville Courier-Journal newspaper reported that police initially thought Alberta's death might have been an accident, even though she had 2 cuts on her forehead. Even though her body was found in the river with no shoes, no wig, no dentures. The coroner agreed with the accident theory. He determined that she had died from drowning. Case closed. Or so it seemed. But that theory didn't last long. That same night, About 10 blocks away from where Alberta's body was discovered, a neighbor called the police. There was a car parked on her street. It had been sitting there for a couple of days. She thought it might be abandoned or stolen. Someone should check it out. When police arrived, they ran the plates. The car was the rental that Alberta had been driving, a white 1965 Ford Fairlane. And when they looked inside, they found something that changed everything. Blood. There was blood on the back seat, blood on the floor, blood on the back of the front seat. The car was soaked in it. And there was more. Alberta's upper denture, the one that was missing from her mouth, was lying on the floor in the back seat. There were also pieces of brick on the seat. Brick. Not rocks. Brick. After discovering that car and everything inside it, the police immediately changed their theory. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. But here's the thing you need to understand. This was 1965. DNA testing didn't exist. Forensic science was basic at best. Police couldn't do the things we take for granted today. They couldn't extract DNA from blood. They couldn't match genetic material. They couldn't build a profile from skin cells or hair follicles. What they could do was lift fingerprints. That was basically it. So police processed the car. They pulled fingerprints from the steering wheel. They collected the pieces of brick. They documented the blood. And they sent everything to the FBI for analysis. Within just a few days, what had started as a possible accident, what the coroner had initially ruled as a drowning, was now officially being investigated as a homicide. Someone had killed Alberta Jones. On August 8th, for days after Alberta died, police announced they had found her missing shoes. They were discovered about 10 feet from the exit of the bridge, near where her body had been pulled from the water. And then a witness came forward. Someone who lived in Louisville's West End, not far from where Alberta was last seen, told police they had heard something that night. Around 2:15 in the morning, they heard a woman screaming. The witness said they looked out their window and saw a man dragging a woman toward a car. And there was another man already inside the vehicle. That witness statement added a whole new dimension to the investigation. It suggested there were two attackers. It suggested Alberta had been grabbed, dragged, forced into a car while she screamed for help. And nobody came. The autopsy results came back. Alberta had 2 lacerations on her head. She also had bruises and abrasions on other parts of her body. These were not injuries consistent with accidentally falling into water. These were injuries from an assault, from being attacked, from being struck. Police started building a theory. They suggested that Alberta might have been attacked while stopped at a red light. Maybe someone approached her car, forced their way in, hit her, knocked her unconscious, then drove her to the bridge and threw her body into the Ohio River. They theorized that her shoes might have been tossed out the window as the car drove back over the bridge. It's a plausible theory, but even with that scenario, there are massive questions. If Alberta was randomly attacked at a stoplight, why? What was the motive? Was it robbery? Was it something else? The police, at least publicly, seemed confident. They had her shoes. They had a bloodstained car. They had fingerprints. They had pieces of brick. They had a witness who saw a woman being dragged. On paper, it looked like they had a lot to work with. But the most important question remained unanswered. Who killed Alberta Jones? And why? Let me ask you something. What do you think the motive was here? Why would someone want Alberta Jones dead? Was it because of her work as a prosecutor? Was it because she was a black woman with authority in the Jim Crow South? Was it random violence? Or was it something else entirely? Drop your theory in the comments. I really want to know what you think happened. From the very beginning, investigators had to consider multiple possibilities. Alberta Jones wasn't just some random person. She wasn't just someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was Louisville's first black female prosecutor. She was a civil rights leader. She had organized thousands of black voters. She had helped vote out white politicians who refused to support civil rights. She prosecuted cases where white men had to answer to her in a courtroom. This was 1965. Malcolm X had been assassinated earlier that same year. Violence against black leaders wasn't theoretical. It was real. It was constant. It was deadly. So was it possible that someone targeted Alberta because of her work? Because of her position? Because of what she represented? Yes, absolutely possible. Investigators also had to consider robbery as a motive. She was driving a rental car. Maybe someone thought she had money. Maybe someone saw a woman driving alone late at night and decided she was an easy target. But if it was a robbery, why was there so much violence? Why throw her in a river? And there was another angle. Around the same time Alberta was killed, several other women in Louisville had also been murdered. Unsolved cases. Was there a pattern? Was there someone attacking women in the city? Could Alberta have been the victim of a serial predator? In the end, the evidence didn't strongly support the serial killer theory. The circumstances of Alberta's death seemed different from the others. So police kept coming back to the witness statement. The woman who was heard screaming. The man dragging her. The second man in the car. But in the weeks that followed, there weren't many public updates. No clear suspect emerged. Nothing concrete. In October of 1965, 2 months after Alberta's death, the Independent Voters Association held a memorial service in her honor. This was the organization Alberta had founded. The organization that had registered 6,000 black voters. At the service, Louisville's safety director, Kenneth Newman, delivered a eulogy. And he told the crowd something that must have given them hope. He said, quote, "In the last few days, we have discovered some evidence which leads us to believe we are on the threshold of solving this mystery." On the threshold? That sounds promising, right? Like they were close to an arrest. Close to justice. But by November of 1965, a coroner's jury made their official determination. Alberta Jones died by drowning. Cause of death, unknown person. In other words, homicide. But no suspect. The detectives assigned to the case testified before the jury. They said the evidence that had been sent to the FBI had been, quote, determined to have no value. More than 30 items had been collected from Alberta's car. Blood samples, fingerprints, the brick pieces, all of it sent to the FBI for analysis. And none of it led anywhere. None of it produced results they could use. Police told the Courier-Journal that they had interviewed over 300 people. 300. And they still had no viable suspect. They called it an exhaustive investigation. They said they weren't giving up, but they had hit a wall. Even as police were saying they'd done everything they could, new details kept emerging. Details that made the timeline of that night even messier. One newspaper article stated that Alberta and Gladys went to a downtown restaurant at 11:45 p.m. But if the phone call from Gladys came at 11:30, as both women reportedly told police in 1965, that leaves just 15 minutes. 15 minutes for Alberta to receive the call, drive across town to Gladys's house, try on a wig, and then travel downtown to a restaurant. That timeline doesn't work. It's physically impossible. So either the call happened earlier than 11:30, or someone wasn't telling the truth about what really happened that night. Another article added yet another detail. After leaving Gladys's home, Alberta allegedly stopped at a store to buy something to drink. And it was right after that when the witness heard a woman screaming. So if Alberta got out of her car to go into a store, maybe that's when someone approached her. Maybe that's when she was grabbed. Maybe that's when she was forced back into her own vehicle. It's possible, but we don't know for sure. Here's something that wasn't widely publicized at the time. Something that only came out later. Police actually arrested 2 suspects in connection with Alberta's murder. 2 people. We don't know their names. We don't know what evidence connected them to the crime. But we know that when prosecutors took that evidence to a grand jury, the jury looked at everything and said no. Not enough. Insufficient evidence. The grand jury declined to pursue charges. And those 2 suspects walked free. So police were back to square one. No motive they could prove. No forensic evidence strong enough to convict. No charges filed. And slowly, quietly, Alberta Jones's case started to fade from public attention. The case remained technically open, but the public didn't hear much about it. 3 years went by. And then, in July of 1968, something strange happened. Someone was walking near the bridge, the same bridge where police believed Alberta had been thrown from, and they found a purse. It had been there for 3 years, exposed to the weather, but it was still in relatively good condition. And it belonged to Alberta Jones. Inside the purse was her wallet. There was no cash, but there was a $200 check made out to Alberta. There were her credit cards. There was also a partial dental plate. And several keychains. Now, think about that for a second. If this was a robbery, if someone killed Alberta to steal from her, why would they leave her credit cards? Why would they leave a $200 check? Why would they throw the purse away near the bridge, but keep the cash? It doesn't add up. Police told reporters they had, quote, real good suspects. But they also admitted they couldn't build a strong enough case to prosecute anyone. So once again, nothing happened. No arrests. No charges. The investigation stalled. 13 years passed. By 1978, most people in Louisville had forgotten about Alberta Jones. Her case was cold, dormant. So the Courier-Journal decided to revisit it, to bring attention back to this unsolved murder. But instead of providing clarity, the article introduced even more confusion. In this 1978 article, the newspaper reported something different. They said that on the night Alberta died, she had called Gladys, not the other way around. For 13 years, the story had been that Gladys called Alberta and asked her to come over for a wig fitting. But now the newspaper was saying Alberta made the call. Why? To discuss something about different standards between black and white communities. That's a completely different narrative. No explanation was given for why the story had changed. No new evidence was cited. Just a quiet, subtle shift in who picked up the phone that night. And after that article, the case went quiet again. 40 years passed. For decades. No arrests. No charges. No answers. Alberta's name slowly disappeared from public memory. Most people in Louisville didn't even know who she was anymore. And then, in 2010, something big happened. Louisville Metro Police made a stunning announcement. They said they believed they had identified the person responsible for Alberta Jones's murder. After 45 years, they thought they knew who did it. But there was a massive problem. They didn't have enough evidence to charge him. Detectives said that unless the suspect confessed, there was nothing more they could do. The man they identified was living in California. He had been 17 years old in 1965 when Alberta was killed. He was an adult now, middle-aged, and he denied any involvement. He said he didn't do it. Police administered a polygraph test. He failed. But polygraph results aren't admissible in court. They can't be used as evidence. Cold case detectives were convinced this man was responsible for Alberta's death. But 45 years had passed. Witnesses couldn't remember details anymore. Some of the original investigators were dead. Physical evidence had degraded or been lost. Even if police believed they knew who killed Alberta Jones, they couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. So that man remained free, accused by police but never charged, never arrested, never forced to stand trial. Legally speaking, Alberta's murder was still unsolved. Her family never got justice. There was no trial, no conviction, no one held publicly accountable. I have to ask you this. Do you think the police did everything they could in this case? Or do you think the fact that Alberta was a black woman affected how hard they tried to solve it? Be honest in the comments. I really want to know what you think. Years kept passing. Every once in a while, Alberta's name would pop up in an article about Louisville's history or civil rights legacy. In 2017, a professor at the University of Louisville began working on a comprehensive biography of Alberta's life. That brought some renewed attention to her story. Even the New York Times wrote a piece about it. There was a brief moment where it seemed like Alberta Jones might finally get the recognition she deserved. But then, like always, the attention faded. In 2023, 58 years after Alberta's murder, her case was referred to the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. This was significant. The DOJ was being asked to review whether Alberta Jones had been murdered specifically because she was a black woman in a position of power. Was she killed because she was a prosecutor who dared to challenge white defendants in court? Because she organized thousands of black voters and got white politicians voted out of office? Because she represented everything that segregationists feared? The Department of Justice reviewed the case under federal civil rights statutes. These are laws that allow the federal government to prosecute crimes motivated by racial hatred or designed to interfere with someone's civil rights. If the DOJ found evidence that Alberta was targeted because of her race or her civil rights work, they could potentially bring federal charges, even after all these years. But after their review, the DOJ made an announcement. They were closing the case. They had found no evidence that Alberta's murder was racially motivated. Without that racial element, without evidence of a civil rights violation, the federal government had no jurisdiction, no authority to pursue charges. Case closed. Again, Alberta Jones remains officially listed as a homicide victim. Her murder is technically still an open case. But realistically, it's never going to be solved. She was a pioneering attorney, Louisville's first black female prosecutor, a civil rights leader whose work changed her entire city. And more than 50 years later, we still don't know who killed her. Alberta was 34 years old when she died. In those 34 years, she shattered barriers in education, in law, in politics. She registered thousands of voters. She helped change discriminatory laws. She stood in courtrooms where no one like her had ever stood before. She was brilliant. She was strategic. She was powerful. And then she was gone. Her murder has remained unsolved for 6 decades. Evidence collected in 1965 led nowhere. Suspects were named, but never charged. A purse was found 3 years later. A suspect was identified 45 years later. The DOJ reviewed it 58 years later. And still, nothing. Every time it looks like the case might move forward, it stops. Every time there's a glimmer of hope, it fades. And maybe that's the most painful part of this entire story. Not just that Alberta Jones was murdered, but that a woman who spent her entire life fighting to strengthen the justice system died, without ever receiving justice from that same system. Her name isn't widely known today. There are no major movies about her life. No monuments or memorials. But Alberta Jones mattered. She was part of the foundation of change in Louisville. She was part of the civil rights movement that opened doors for generations who came after her. And her story isn't finished. Not until we know what really happened to her. Not until someone is held accountable. People need to know her name. They need to know what she accomplished. And they need to know that her case is still open. Still waiting for answers that may never come. Let's go back through what we actually know for certain. On the night of August 4th, 1965, Alberta Jones left her home after receiving or making a phone call. The details of that call have changed depending on who tells the story and when. She either went to a friend's house for a wig fitting, or she went to help someone with legal trouble. She either left at 10 p.m. or 11:30 p.m. She either went to a restaurant or she didn't. She was either seen leaving at 1:30 in the morning, or maybe it was earlier. By the morning of August 5th, she was dead in the Ohio River. Her body was found around 15 feet from shore. Her car was discovered 10 blocks away, soaked in blood. Her upper denture was on the floor of the back seat. Pieces of brick were on the seats. Her shoes were found near a bridge. A witness heard a woman screaming at 2:15 a.m. and saw a man dragging a woman toward a car with another man inside. Police arrested 2 suspects early in the investigation, but a grand jury refused to charge them. 3 years later, Alberta's purse was found near the bridge with her credit cards and a check still inside. 45 years later, police identified a man in California as their prime suspect, but they didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him. 58 years later, the Department of Justice reviewed the case and found no evidence of a racially motivated crime. And that's where it stands today, unsolved, unfinished. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is how the story kept changing over the years. In 1965, Flora said the call came at 11:30. In 2018, she said 10. In 1965, Gladys said she called Alberta about a wig. In 2018, Flora said the friend called about legal trouble and accused Alberta of being uppity. 13 years after the murder, a newspaper said Alberta called Gladys, not the other way around. Why do these stories keep shifting? Is it simply memory fading over 5 decades? Is it trauma affecting how people remember that night? Or is there something else? When the last known details of a murder victim's life keep changing, it raises serious questions. Was someone lying from the very beginning? Did someone have a reason to alter their story? Or is this just what happens when a case goes cold and people try to piece together memories from decades ago? We may never know the truth. Think about this. 3 people have been connected to Alberta's murder at different points over the last 60 years. 2 suspects were arrested early in the investigation. Police thought they had enough evidence. But when they brought it to a grand jury, the jury said no. Insufficient. Those 2 people walked free. We don't even know their names today. Then, decades later, detectives identified a 3rd person. A man who was 17 in 1965. He failed a polygraph. But they couldn't charge him. So he walked free too. 3 people. 3 chances for justice. And all 3 walked away. None of them ever had to face a jury. None of them ever had to answer publicly for what happened to Alberta Jones. That's not justice. That's failure. Think about what Alberta could have accomplished if she had lived. She was only 34. She was just beginning. She had already changed Louisville's political landscape. She had already helped pass Kentucky's first public accommodations law. She had already become the city's first black female prosecutor. What else could she have done with another 30 years? Another 40? Imagine Alberta Jones in her 60s. In her 70s. Looking back on a lifetime of breaking barriers and opening doors. Imagine how many more lives she could have changed. How many more young black women she could have inspired. How much more history she could have made. But we'll never know. Because someone took that future from her. Someone decided she had gone too far. And that person, or those people, never paid for it. This is why cases like Alberta's matter. Not just because they're unsolved. Not just because we want closure. But because the person who died mattered. Alberta Jones wasn't just a victim. She was a trailblazer. She was someone who opened doors that had been locked for centuries. And when we let her story fade, when we let her name disappear from history, we're allowing her killers to win. We're saying that what happened to her doesn't matter. But it does matter. It matters to her family, who never got answers or justice. It matters to the people in Louisville who benefited from the work she did. And it matters to anyone who believes that justice shouldn't have an expiration date. Stories like Alberta's aren't just history. They're still happening today. Women in positions of power still face threats. Black women in leadership are still targeted. People who challenge corrupt systems still put themselves at risk. Alberta's story is a reminder that progress always comes with a price. And sometimes, that price is paid by the very people who deserve to be celebrated and protected. After all these years, after all the investigations, after all the renewed interest, there are still so many questions. Who made that phone call on August 4th? Was it really about a wig fitting? Or was there another reason Alberta left her house that night? What happened between the time she left home and the time her body ended up in the river? Who were the two men the witness saw? Were they the same two people police arrested and released? Why was Alberta's purse found 3 years later with money and credit cards still inside? If this wasn't a robbery, what was the motive? Was it connected to her work as a prosecutor? Was it retaliation for her civil rights activism? Was it someone who hated that a black woman had authority over them? Or was it something else entirely? And the biggest question of all, will we ever know the truth? Alberta Jones dedicated her entire life to the legal system. She believed in it. She fought for it. She used it as a tool to create change and demand justice. She stood in courtrooms and argued for fairness under the law. And when she needed that same system to work for her, it failed. The investigation stalled. Evidence led nowhere. The suspects walked free. Decades passed with no answers. The Department of Justice reviewed her case and then closed it without taking action. The system that Alberta Jones fought so hard to strengthen couldn't give her justice. And that failure says something profound about how we value certain lives over others. It says something about who gets justice in America and who doesn't. It says something about what happens when the victim is a black woman, even when that black woman was a prosecutor. I want to hear from you one last time. What do you think really happened to Alberta Jones? Do you think it was random violence? Do you think it was connected to her work as a prosecutor? Do you think someone targeted her specifically because of who she was and what she represented? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, if you think Alberta deserves to be remembered, hit that like button. Share this video. Let's make sure her name doesn't disappear again. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories about people who deserve justice and recognition, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because there are so many more stories out there that need to be told. Alberta Jones deserves better than this. She deserves to be in history books. She deserves to have her story taught in schools. She deserves monuments and memorials. And most of all, she deserves justice, even if it comes 60 years too late. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to learn about someone who changed her city and then disappeared from history. Thank you for caring about a woman whose name should be known everywhere. Because here's what I believe. The opposite of injustice isn't just justice. It's a memory. It's making sure that what happened to Alberta Jones isn't forgotten. It's making sure her name is spoken. Her story is told. Her legacy is honored. Alberta Jones was 34 years old when someone decided the world didn't need her anymore. But they were wrong. We needed her then. We need her now. We need to know her name. This is unfinished record. And Alberta Jones's story, it's still unfinished. We'll see you in the next one.